Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get started. My name is Katie Jacobs from CIPD, and I've been hosting our coronavirus series of webinars. And this afternoon, we've got a really exciting session lined up for you, exploring the impact that COVID-19 has had on company cultures. What has changed, what will stick, and what will we be waving goodbye to? And joining me to discuss this afternoon, I'm joined by Peter Cheese, CEO of CIPD, and Sharron Pamplin, Partner for HR at Deloitte. Also meant to be joined by Tim Jones. Tim is Global Head of HR at London Stock Exchange. We are having some technical issues, so he might pop up at some point. If he doesn't pop up, then I'm sure that Sharron, Peter, and I will be able to have a fantastic discussion without him. But just to let you know that. As ever, I'll just run through some very quick housekeeping notes. A reminder that the session is being recorded and it will be available via the webinar section of the CIPD website from this afternoon. If you go there, you can also access recordings of our previous webinars and sign up for future webinars. We have 2 more coming up for you next week. We're going to be looking at creating learning cultures, and we're going to be looking at youth employment in the light of the summer statement. And after that, we're going to take a little bit of a break over August. If you want to submit any questions during the webinar, can I ask you to please use the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box for questions. A reminder that for legal advice, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline, which is available 24/7. And a reminder to head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for up-to-date information and resources. And as always, a reminder about our new Wellbeing Hub and helpline for members in the UK and Ireland, which provides free access to consultations with therapists for people professionals via our partnership with award-winning workplace wellbeing provider, Health Assured. And we'll give you some more details about that at the end of the session. So let's get on to the topic at hand. The coronavirus pandemic has turned our ways of working upside down. And more than 18 weeks after the UK went into lockdown, and as organisations focus more on rebuild and recovery, now is a good time to reflect on how the COVID crisis has impacted our company cultures. Has it forced organisations to press the reset button and to entirely rethink their cultures? Have organisations with strong cultures going into the crisis been able to leverage this to come out even stronger? And what should organisational cultures look like post-COVID-19 as we try to build a fairer society? Those are the kind of questions we're going to address, and please do ask your own via the Q&A box at any time. Peter's going to open by giving us some quick opening thoughts and setting a little bit of context, and then Sharron will give a case study about her experience leading the HR function at Deloitte and what it's been like for them over the last few months. And then if we get Tim will do the same for his experience, and then we will go into panel discussion. A reminder to please ask questions throughout, not in the last 5 minutes, as keeps happening in these webinars, because then we will not have time to answer them all. We've got a few in advance, which is great, so I'll also address those as well. So that's it from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Peter to kick us off. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon to everybody. It's great to be talking on this subject. I think, like many of you on this call, I'm sure, I've always been a student and fascinated by ideas of culture, and we all remember sayings like, you know, culture can eat strategy for breakfast, and yet often our collective understanding of culture has not been as strong as it should. And now, as Katie's highlighted, I think perhaps the debate about culture and ways of working is never been more central to a lot of the thinking about what will happen next. And I think we're seeing sort of strategy and culture getting very, very intertwined, because a lot of strategy thinking in many businesses now, of course, is so what's the world going to look like post-COVID, but not least, what's my organization going to look like? Where and how might we work differently? What might be some of the different skills and capabilities that we need? And what have we learned during this crisis? And what, after all, has been the biggest experiment in home working that we've ever seen, that we can take forwards as positives in how we connect and how we work as businesses. I think, you know, the external shifts, aside from these being the biggest shifts we've ever seen, and I always think about the shifts not just in terms of the pandemic, but, you know, after all, we've been living through a period of time where the environment has become so much more important to us and our responsibilities as businesses in that regard. We've now got things like Black Lives Matter, which is again reminding us of many of the societal challenges we face, and as Katie touched on, therefore ideas like inclusion becoming more and more important. And then, of course, you know, what we're now moving into, which is clearer and clearer, which is an economic crisis. So they are massive shifts. I think also what is driving, and those of course force us all to be more agile and to think very strategically. But there's also, I think, added elements of scrutiny. I mean, the reality of a crisis which has been driven very much by sort of humanity, if you will, and people's health and well-being, is of course forcing us to think internally more about those things, but it's certainly causing more scrutiny externally. So how do organizations respond to all of this? How do they treat their people as a result of this crisis? If they're going to restructure, what are they doing? And we can all read the headlines. I mean, almost every organization that is perceived not to be treating their people well in some of these things is certainly coming in for an awful lot of scrutiny and to some degrees, real challenge about how they're thinking about these things. Or other ideas like how they've accessed government funds. It's been notable since the more recent announcements by Rishi Sunak in the UK about paying perhaps £1,000 for people coming back off furlough, that a number of organizations, and I think rightly, have said, but why would we take that money? We're going to bring them back anyway, and we shouldn't need that kind of incentive, and we shouldn't be taking that kind of money. So you've got scrutiny on those levels as well. But as I said, I think when you then boil that down to what are we thinking about cultures internally, what do we take forwards from all of this as positive learnings? I think a whole bunch of things, ranging from, as I said, this idea that strategy and culture are getting very, very intertwined, because so many of the strategic questions about organizations now do really relate to our cultures, how we treat our people, how we work together, and our ways of working, and so on. I think this idea of purpose is being revisited. We've been talking about purpose for quite a while, but being more clear on our purpose, and particularly clear on our purpose in terms of our responsibilities to all stakeholders, this multi-stakeholder idea, particularly our employees, but also recognizing that if you're a company with investors, the things like ESG, environmental, social, and governance, again, have got another big ramp up through all of this on my point about scrutiny. But I think very centrally to the idea of culture has always been and is being strengthened through this crisis is the idea of people at the very center of the business agenda and business thinking. And what is encouraging to me, and so many businesses are talking about this much more directly, that people are absolutely essential to our business. They are our key assets. But how we treat them, how we look after them, their well-being, and all those other ideas which we talked about for so long have had a real catalyst through this. And ideas like caring and compassion, and the very idea of well-being moving significantly beyond. I mean, if I just take simple examples like that old thing of, how are you feeling today? And people say, fine, and then you move the conversation on. People really asking that question with meaning behind it. Now, how are you really? And people checking in much more with their team members, because they have to, because we're not seeing them every day. They're working remotely, people working in different circumstances, and often very difficult circumstances, that is forcing us to connect to our people in very different ways. So the whole idea of caring and compassion and well-being, I think, being ramped up. Connection and communication, as I said, already linked to that. Many business leaders I talk to now, and I would include myself in that, would say they've never communicated with their people and their organization more, because they know that in a time of great uncertainty, when people are disconnected from the normal office chatter and all of those other things, that we've got to work a lot harder in how we communicate. And I, for one, would say that those are really positive things to take forwards into a culture of the future, where I think most of us, and I'm sure you hear it from Sharron, are saying our organizations are not going to just flip back to what we did before. We're going to learn and give people choice about where and how they work, which will be probably a more dispersed workforce. We're not all going to be doing the old 9 to 5, Monday to Friday things, which frankly are paradigms that have needed to change for a long time. We'll have more choice, more ability to give people choice in how and where they work. And that puts greater emphasis, therefore, on the things which we've learned through this crisis, on things like communication and connection. But it calls out other ideas too, like trust and empowerment. And again, how long have we been talking about those things? They're so central to culture, to the idea that do we trust our people and do our people trust us? And all of this debate about things like presenteeism, and all our surveys as the CIPD and others besides have shown that the issues of well-being and mental health, of this fixation on presenteeism, have been growing, not declining. And now this crisis perhaps creates a real opportunity of change to shift that balance away from those ideas, that we can understand and trust people based on what they produce and what they output, and not how much they're present in an office or sat in front of a computer screen. And we've been forced to think about those ideas now through this crisis. So I think those create some very interesting cultural dynamics as well. And as I say, this whole notion of trust, not just trust up to the leadership, do I trust my leaders, but do the leaders trust my people, and can I trust them to get on with their jobs without thinking that I've got to scrutinize them all the time, or that I'm only going to measure their performance by how much time they spend in the office. So, and then other ideas like diversity and inclusion, and this is also very, very cultural. We have an opportunity, I believe, to push harder, and we must, I mentioned Black Lives Matter and so forth, to push harder on inclusion. And that the fact of more flexible working does create that opportunity for people from different backgrounds, different circumstances to engage meaningfully in the world of work. We're hearing more and more now about the disparity of the economic recovery across the country and difficult spots of economic activity across the United Kingdom, which are not just based on industry sector, but they are based in locality. And if we can create more flexible ways of working, why couldn't people in perhaps parts of the country where the job opportunities are much reduced participate and work wherever that may be? And those are really, really powerful ideas. But what we have to guard against is this flip back. And we've already seen evidence that in restructuring of organizations, that we do not keep a clear line of sight on inclusion and diversity, those things can start to dissipate very, very quickly. And so we're already starting to see concerns in the media about more women being let go or made redundant through some of the restructuring that's starting to happen. Because perhaps it's the part-time workers, which might have more predominantly women involved, who are being let go first, which ironically is strange when you think that, yeah, but the whole thing we've learned through these ways of working surely is that we can engage people in these different ways. So some very important points about the importance of inclusion to good, healthy corporate cultures, but recognizing again, these things will not happen by themselves, and we have to keep a very strong focus on them. And other ideas that are emerging, I think, also about as we move into these next phases of what's going to happen in the post-COVID world, is how do you bring people back from furlough? What happens in restructuring? How do I treat people in these sorts of ways? And as I said at the very beginning, we are under more scrutiny as organizations that if you're going to have to restructure, how do you do that in a responsible way that looks after people as best you can? Perhaps it helps them in coaching or upskilling or reskilling to find other opportunities beyond your organization. And those are very big and very challenging questions. And those are things that we as the CIPD believe in very strongly, but also are trying to influence government thinking and support. And there are some positive messages coming from government on things like encouraging more coaching and support, for example, that we all need to engage with. So I think to sum up, we talked about culture in many, many different ways, but as I said, I think strategy and culture now have never been more interwoven, because it's talking to all these different dynamics of organizations, ways of working, a whole shift, a paradigm shift away from many ways of working that we've had for so long, almost literally since the industrial age, into something that could really be different and better, which will encourage more inclusion, encourage trust in people in different ways, as I've touched on. But my strong and fervent belief on this is those are positives which you can take forward, but they are not going to happen by accident. We have to see these as part of our strategy going forward. We have to embed them in our strategic thinking. We have to drive them from the very tops of organizations and make sure we are measuring and holding ourselves to account for these ideas. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about what we do in organizations and creating healthy cultures. I also believe that we are all, as business leaders, and perhaps particularly in our profession, under more scrutiny for good reason than perhaps we've ever been before. But as I say, to finish on a positive, I think there's a real opportunity now for us to take these ideas forward and create better, healthier, more diverse organizations that are more responsive, more flexible, more agile, more innovative for the future. And after all, those are things which drive both business outcomes, individual outcomes, economic outcomes, and fundamentally, perhaps on top of all, positive societal outcomes as well. So let me hand back to Katie on that note.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a really brilliant overview and a fantastic call to arms as well for the profession. I hope everybody listening is feeling suitably inspired. And we've got some great questions coming in already. Do keep those coming. I'm going to hand over to Sharron now, and Sharon's going to pick up, I think, on some of the themes that Peter's mentioned, but bring them to life in an organisational context. Over to you, Sharron.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. I think it's so interesting hearing what Peter said about some of the opportunities that the last few months have provided to us as an organisation. And I think whilst it's something that we would never have anticipated or probably wished for, certainly it's posed some challenges, but also many of the opportunities, and made us really ask questions about the way that we work, that we took for granted or perhaps assumed historically that we couldn't change. I was talking with Dave Ulrich last week, and he said something about culture, which I thought was interesting. And he said that when we talk about culture, we should ask what's the value of it? And he concluded that we spend time in our internal culture so that it helps us to succeed in the marketplace. And whilst that's also obviously very important to organisations, I think that Peter talked about purpose and some other things that are also really critical to us all. And as an organisation in the last few months, we've been grappling with another question in relation to our culture, which is how do we make work for our workforce? Bit of a mouthful, but I think a really important thing that we should be considering. So we're a professional services firm. We've got about 360,000 people worldwide and about 18,000 of those here in the UK. And luckily, we can mostly work from home. So as an organisation, we were able to arrange that very, very swiftly. And I know that many organisations, it would have been more complex and difficult for them to do so. We haven't had to take up the opportunity of furlough either because of that way that we could go into lockdown so quickly. Like many, we recently reopened, though, a small number of our offices, and most of us are still, however, working from home. Probably just about 10% of the workforce needed to return. And as Peter talked about well-being earlier, we certainly provided the opportunity for those who found it more difficult for various reasons to work from home to be able to return to the office. So it wasn't just about work that needed to be done there. We operate a very flexible working policy, but we're also conscious that our people are now navigating around a myriad of other responsibilities. So we've had to put things in place to enable greater flexibility, for example, enabling our people to work from times when it really suits them around family and other commitments, school agendas, etc. So not normal office hours, and also introduce things like short-term sabbaticals for people with caring responsibilities. So there's quite a few things that we've had to do very quickly and very differently to accommodate things in the lockdown process. But they're things that we want to talk about so that we don't lose some of the things that we've learned as we go forward. Being part of a global company, we've been able to learn from our global colleagues as well about what they've experienced. Some of them went into lockdown more quickly and therefore into recovery sooner. And they've shared things with us to help us with our recovery planning. And that's been quite interesting. So for Asia, for example, pretty much very quickly went back to more of a normal working regime, perhaps not implementing so many changes. Scandinavia did warn us to make sure that we sorted out the coffee before we actually got everybody back into the UK offices. So that was a very important tip for us there. It was quite a letdown, I think. They thought they would be going back into a more normal workplace than perhaps they found. So been quite a few interesting things that we've been trying to learn from across the organisation more globally. Danielle, if you could just move on to my next slide, that would be great. So at the start of the lockdown, one of the things that we did was we established principles that would help to guide the actions that then we took from the initial response and now into recovery, that are helping us to think about how we go forward from here. So firstly, it was about how do we protect our people and look after their well-being? How do we support our clients? And how do we ensure the long-term resilience of our firm? And we've used those principles very much as sort of guiding lines to each thing that we've now done. So as our thinking developed, so too is our appetite to create a culture in which all of our colleagues can thrive in the post-COVID world. We really do want to push the boundaries to the art of the possible by challenging the way that we do things and asking ourselves, what's the purpose now of the workplace, and how can we create a seamless experience between the physical and the virtual workplace of the future? So I think, as Peter touched on, we're certainly not anticipating going back into the way that we used to operate. I think we'd like to capitalise on the things that we've learned. So as we've been thinking about it, there's a few key priorities that have started to emerge for us. Firstly, how do we bottle the brilliance of what we've learned during this period and not just learn from it, but build on it? How do we challenge how we use our space, so the physical workspace, moving away probably from people coming and going to the office just to use their desks, but to create an environment for collaboration and for socialising, which we have realised is really important, both to our people, but also for the way that we do business. And then how do we support our people understanding that our workforce is very diverse and they will require different forms of support? And I think something that Peter said that really resonated with me is that inclusion has always been a really important item for us as an organisation. And something that we've seen that's been really interesting is that through lockdown, and as we're starting to re-emerge from that, we're actually able to really prioritise and drive forward our inclusion agenda in a way that we perhaps hadn't anticipated. One of the examples I'll just share with you, I was talking to one of our audit partners the other day, and he said that we've had an opportunity to reinvent the way that we do audit. So part of an audit is doing an inventory, and if you imagine that if you were doing that in some form of warehouse environment, you would physically have to go into that workspace and physically count pallets, for example. But we've been able to reimagine the way that we do that because we've had to. And as a consequence, it's enabled us to say, if we can change the way that we've worked because of this situation, how can we now allow that to provide us an opportunity where we can allow people to work when they want to, where they want to, and perhaps that opens up both for us a new diverse talent pool, but also hopefully makes us more accessible to people who are interested in working for us as an organisation that might have ruled us out historically because of the way that they were required to work. So we've been actively seeking contributions for our people to talk about the way that we work in the future, and maybe a little bit of survey fatigue, but we thought it was really important to gain their views and their insights. And Danielle, if you can move on to the next slide for me, these are some of the sort of insights that we've started to glean. So one of them is that it's not enough to simply shift our current ways of working into a digital world. Whilst our IT department did a wonderful job of getting Zoom in place and enabling us all to work remotely really effectively, really quickly, we've realised that we need to fundamentally rethink how we organise, how we operate, and how we behave as an organisation, and use our digital platforms to enable that, so it becomes a supporter rather than the driver, if you like. We know that our people have adapted really well. They've adopted new technologies, they've got much clearer focus in meetings, and we've seen much more agility in decision making, which has been fabulous. But we also do recognise that our business is built on creativity and innovation, and our people do need to be able to do that in order to collaborate and to work effectively together. So thinking about the workplace, we need to not lose those coffee chats that we used to have, which we do recognise that's how some of our relationships are made. And I think Peter was talking earlier about the fact that new people joined our organisation, and no doubt many other organisations, and have probably never met each other than virtually, as we're doing today. So we also know that a sense of belonging and purpose is really important. Peter touched on purpose earlier, and certainly it's important to us in attracting and retaining key talent. We also know that the availability and the visibility of leadership has been really important through this period. But we recognise that that side of desk chat is really important to our people, and we need to think about how we can retain that, perhaps even if we did maintain some more form of virtual working. So our people directly have said, starting with the positives of remote working during lockdown, about things that are important to them about our culture, is that whilst they've adapted well to remote working, they've really enjoyed much more flexibility at times that have worked better for them. And many people have actually shared in focus groups that they'd like to continue to work from home, perhaps doing something like a couple of days of working in the office, a couple of days working from home once lockdown does end. They've also said that it's been really important to them that they felt like one team, and we've been able, we're very disparate as an organisation, a lot of offices throughout the UK and globally, but it's meant that we've been able to connect more easily with colleagues around the world. And in fact, many of our people have been excited about the fact that they may not have to live in a city in order to work with us in the future. We've also recognised for ourselves, and Peter touched on it, that we can have a culture of presenteeism. It does force some individuals to feel that they have to come into the office and be seen, and perhaps that's probably unnecessary, is what we've learned through lockdown. Like many organisations, we've found that we've been incredibly productive through this period, and therefore we're hopeful that that culture can actually start to shift and change. And our people have also commented on how lockdown's been a leveller. They've talked about the fact that everybody's the same size on Zoom, which is great, but they've also said that it's been really nice to have more access to their leaders than ever before in a much more informal way, and that's something that we've recognised as important. There have been challenges. Peter had talked about that, and certainly we've recognised them as well. And we've been constantly surveying our staff about their well-being and have dialogues about that. And some people have certainly commented that it's been quite a challenge during the lockdown period to try to work from home whilst caring for family, having various distractions around them. And also some of our people don't have the spaces that are supportive of remote working, and therefore that's been more challenging. Some of our more junior people as well have said that learning on the job hasn't been quite so easy, and they have noticed that absence of their team, their leader, their colleagues being sat around them, physically providing with that face-to-face coaching and support. So that's something else that we've been very mindful of. So I think, Danielle, if you could just move on to my last slide. I think one of the things that we would conclude is that lockdown very much has showed us that there is a great opportunity to reflect here on about how we work in a much more distributed way. And the impact on our business, our teams, our individuals is something that we're very mindful of, but we've also learned such a lot that's been so positive. Business agility is clearly going to be a key requirement for us for the future. The current environment has forced people to really speed up their decision making. It's reduced bureaucracy without increasing risk. And I think that that's been a game changer, certainly from an HR perspective. And it's something that I'm personally keen that we do maintain and hang on to. We've learned a lot about how we use technology, but I think that it's one of the things that we need to really think about for the future. I think some people have commented about the always on culture, so that's something that we're very mindful of. So we need to think now about what policies do we need to change, what's our overall narrative going to be, and what risks do we need to mitigate. But we certainly plan to maximise what we have learned from COVID. And we're really keen to build a future of work that listens to our workforce and enables them and puts them firmly at the centre of what we do. So they've been very much the lessons that we've learned. A lot of what Peter had talked about today, and clearly a lot for us to do and reflect on from what our people have said. So exciting times ahead, I think, Katie.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and I'm delighted that Tim came on during that. So Tim, could you unmute yourself, please? Welcome. Just test that your sound's working.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Katie.
I'm going to mute myself and hand over to you, Tim, to tell your story.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone, and Peter and Katie, thanks so much for the invite. And Sharon, good to present with you. So I'm going to give some insights, more of a case study in terms of what we've done at the London Stock Exchange Group. And just to give people some context, we're a business which is circa 5,000 people, globally based across 20 countries. So quite an international business with circa 40% of our colleagues in the UK and high densities of colleagues in Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Romania, Italy, France, and the US also. And what I'd like to do is just talk to you about particularly how we've taken an approach to COVID and the response to that, which is framed in a context of we actually feel quite privileged as an organisation, because whilst of course our organisation is affected by the crisis, many of the services that we provide and the importance of what we do within the financial services and financial market infrastructure businesses is critical when there may be times of stress within the markets or stress within businesses. So Daniel, if you could go to the next slide, please. I'd just like to give you some context. Whenever I've talked about our group before, I'm conscious that in many aspects we have quite a global presence, but we're a B2B business. So if you think about our key aspects of what we do, it's primarily around in capital formation, that's stock exchanges. As an example, the London Stock Exchange, Borsa Italiana, and the infrastructure that comes with that. When it comes to risk balance sheet management, that's very much around clearing and settlement. So those very important transactions that take place within financial communities. And information services is very much brands you may be familiar with, such as FTSE or Russell in the US, which is a lot around data and the importance of the management of data and the provision of that information. Very much framed with very resilient and high quality technology and operational excellence. And that's one of the reasons that many of our colleagues are based in other locations around the world. Now, we've been operating in a similar way that Sharon described in lockdown, 100% from home from early March. And the context in how we're operating is also framed with, at the moment as an organisation, we're in the process of completing a transaction with Refinitiv, Now, Refinitiv is a former division of Thomson Reuters, the financial risk division. It's circa 19,000 colleagues in 70 countries. And one of the things that we've been wrestling with as a management team is not only the importance of how we lead the business during this time, how we support our colleagues during COVID, but also just spare a thought for thinking about how you start to plan and integrate with an organization when you're not physically meeting with people. You can all appreciate when you're seeking to get cultural alignment, when you're seeking to understand businesses, when you're making selection decisions, the benefits of doing that face-to-face have suddenly had to be rethought. And that's been a real learning for us as a management team. So if you could, Danielle, if you could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to just draw your attention to some aspects. I think many organizations will state their values, their behaviors, their beliefs. And for me, the COVID crisis is an example of where some companies have been really able to embrace and take an approach which aligns to their values. So for us, the concepts of partnership, integrity, and innovation has meant that we've really, in many cases, not even missed a beat in terms of the services and the provision of, particularly for clients, in terms of how we've approached things. And in a moment, I'm going to show you, it's not just rhetoric from me, but I'm going to show you some data points which we've been able to test and evaluate. And I know Katie's smiling at this point because I'd really like to ensure with my team, if we're going to add value to an organization, we can actually measure it. We can put metrics around it at the same time. And that's very important for us to ensure that we're demonstrating value. So these values, these behaviors have actually meant that you'll see in a moment when we've surveyed our colleagues, when we've talked to them, they feel more connected than in a pre-COVID world. They've actually got a greater assessment of our leadership approach than in a pre-COVID world, which I think is quite stark. So if you could just go on to the next slide, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things that we've really driven. I think all organizations have an increasing focus on well-being, and I think that it is now more important than ever before. We typically choose around the 5 well-being initiatives, but it's particularly for us around the emotional and the physical well-being where we've really had to think differently. So from a standing start, we actually developed online mandatory training tools around ergonomics. Mandatory sounds as if it was quite cumbersome, but what the team did is literally in 2 days, they designed a module to help people ensure that they were sitting correctly, that they had the right equipment in place. We also, for all our managers and colleagues in the group, we gave them an allowance to go out and help invest in the right kit if they didn't feel that they were able to work from home. And as you can appreciate, we're fortunate that all of our colleagues can work from home. Perhaps it's the emotional well-being, which is something I think every organization has placed a huge focus on. This is becoming even more important as I think people are starting to have a level of weariness with screen time, as colleagues are having an impact about how they maintain motivation. We've done some tracking of our holidays and we're really pushing people to take their holidays, but actually the number of people that have physically taken them in a COVID world versus in a normal working environment is much lower than it should be. And that's something we're really focused on in trying to improve. So these areas are quite constant. And what we've noticed is that people are clearly blurring the lines between are they physically working from home or sleeping in the office. And we're trying to enable situations where they're taking time out, breaking things up. And, you know, it's okay to be walking and having a meeting on the telephone. It's okay to get some fresh air. It's okay to think differently in terms of how we're operating. One of the other aspects that we've really had to look at in terms of this is how we continue to bring in different technology tools to enable people to brainstorm, to critique, to iterate, because as any team, the importance of working together is somewhat lost in this strange environment. So we've tried to bring in technology tools such as Microsoft Teams at pace to really enable that and to really accelerate that focus. So that for us has been a real core pillar, and it's been recognized by our colleagues. If Danielle, we could go to the next slide now, please. I just wanted to show you a very quick example. Like all organizations, we place huge emphasis on the engagement of our people and our leaders. And these are good results, in my opinion, from a pre-COVID world. So in terms of relatively high levels of engagement with the organization. But for us, there's definitely was always some focus in areas such as leadership and management as well. I don't want to dwell on these, but I'm going to refer to them in a moment when I show you some of the initiatives we've taken and the impact in a moment. But I just wanted to give you a highlight. This is how we were engaged with our colleagues up to the end of last year. So Danielle, if you could go to the next slide now, please. So we've done a number of things. One of my favorite has been the social exchange. So we're all partnered with different colleagues around the world. So this morning I had a social exchange, a Skype meeting with a colleague in Dubai. And last week it was with a colleague in Romania. And the week before that it was with a colleague in Sri Lanka. And these are just literally like those coffee chats, those discussions that typically would happen in an office environment. We're just connecting in a different way. And what's been fascinating is our colleagues actually feel more connected when we're in 5,000 offices than when we're in 20. So there's been some significant learnings for us as an organization in the way that we go about that. That's been very, very powerful. As an executive committee, we often will host virtual, typically do them over a coffee or breakfast. We're now hosting virtual chats with colleagues around the globe. We developed quickly a microsite with tools, with best practice, much of it linked to external material, but also adding our own material. And I'll talk about some of the manager interventions in a moment. And constantly the theme for us is particularly around mental health and well-being at the center of it. So these are some of the things that we've done. I recognize all companies are doing it, but for us, it's connected with our colleagues in a different way than we had before. So Danielle, if you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we had intended to do this year was build on a manager excellence program and a leadership program. Unfortunately, we only got one cohort out the door in February before we had to rein it all back in. So what we've done is we've shifted the approach, and we've now built, and it's still live in its implementation, but every week or 2 weeks, there is a webinar or a learning module where our managers, all of them across the globe, are invited to attend. And this just shows you the examples. So some of it is about how they lead in a crisis, how you lead and manage virtually, how you keep people motivated and productive. We've had, I think, circa 1,200 attendees to these webinars, and there's still more coming. And the intent is short bursts of activity, best practice, thought leadership, tips of how to get the best out of the people. And you can see the subsequent ones. Firstly, it was around adapting to challenge. Then we've moved more to empathy and engagement. And now, because this is prolonged, we're focusing that around focus and resilience. They're videoed, so they're always available to people if they can't attend. And the feedback, as you can see, has been fantastic. So that's really been about upskilling skills and capability of our managers, because they are having to lead and manage, as we know, in a very different way. Danielle, if you could go to the next slide, please. What's interesting is we obviously track, like everybody does, the output of these types of programs. And we've really tried to hone our management excellence. So as you can see, on the top line here is what typically will be face-to-face sessions in a normal environment, and the level of not just responses, but in terms of feedback face-to-face sessions. We've also held specialist manager sessions by country. You can see them listed on the left-hand side. Why by country? Because some of the arrangements are different. In Sri Lanka, our colleagues are often living in homes without air conditioning, whereas in the office, they're an air-conditioned environment. For them, actually getting back to the office is quite important. In our locations where we've got graduates, some of them are tired of sharing kitchen tables with 5 other colleagues in a shared house, trying to get the best out of their operating. So we're having to put specialist support mechanisms in place for those individuals. What's been really powerful is that what has led this has not just been by an HR colleague, but it's often been led and participated in by leaders and managers around the organization, giving real, quite authentic experience, which has meant that the level of responsiveness, the facilitation, the feedback has been very, very positive. We've probably done more of this type of training than we would do in a normal world. We've actually ramped up the level of activity because of the importance of it. So Danielle, could you go to the next slide, please? So what we decided to do was that we would survey to see how we were doing. The team developed a survey in a week. We surveyed, we allowed people to participate for a week. We analysed the results in a week. And these are the headline results. And if you can just reflect back to some of the have your say data around our typical engagement surveys, you can see the impact. So 63% participated. But what was interesting is that 94% felt that we responded well to dealing with the pandemic. Where it's quite interesting, if you look at the top right of this slide, 92% were confident about the leader's ability during this time. That compared to 70% normally. When it came about managers, 86% felt they were being effectively managed compared to 70% normally. So what we felt this demonstrated is that the efforts and the support, actually people were leaning in and doing more than they would perhaps in a normal working environment. For me, these become the norm. Whatever capacity we all return to office in the future, these are best practice aspects for us that we will continue to maintain. And if you look at the well-being aspect, which was a central pillar of what I spoke about earlier, you can see that 81% of people know who they need to speak to. What was fascinating, if you could go to the next slide, please. What I just wanted to show you here, and very happy if anyone would like access to the questions. We presented our results to the board, and as you'll appreciate, all boards have directors that can often sit on other companies. Many of them ask for our questions to share them in other organizations that they worked in, and these are the type of things that we were asking. So why I just wanted to show you this is the type of focus that for us was quite important. I've listed just at the top right there what we call career stages, the different hierarchies within the organization. And I'd just like to draw your attention to three things. On the right there, you can see in terms of the level of support is felt, particularly from a manager perspective, is high. This is higher than normal for us, and we think is a direct response to the manager's effort. What's interesting, if you then look a little further down at the remote working, to the second yellow bubble, when you see the question under remote working, I'm able to work effectively, irrespective of the level, everyone is broadly the same. They feel they can operate in a working from home setup in a workspace. What's interesting is the more senior the person is, or the more reports that they have, when it comes to productivity, it declines. And that for us is a real area of interest, because when someone is an individual contributor, we sense they're able to manage their time and their resources more effectively. But at a manager and leadership level, we recognize it's harder to get the best out of people in this environment. And you can see there that we've got some areas that we want to focus on and improve. What's interesting, the third circle at the very bottom, we asked our colleagues when things return back into a return to office scenario, what level of remote working would they like? And you can see there the response was 59%. So what that means is that people are thinking in the future that they would like to work 3 days a week from home. Anecdotally, in some of the feedback that we got, which because we asked for written comments too, was absolutely clear that people had really determined that amount based on concerns around public transport in financial centres in which we operate. It was the concern about travelling on public transport rather than our ability to set up the office. That aligns completely with an EY survey that was completed fairly recently, where 30% of people felt that that would be the type of percentage they'd be working from home in the future. So if we could go to the next slide now, please. We're going to be moving back to Katie in terms of questions. But what I just wanted to do was thank you for listening today. If anyone would like access to obviously these slides through the webinar or any of the questions, we're happy to share them. Recognise we haven't got it all right, but you can see some of the data related improvements suggest we've got it more right than not. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing that, and thanks for your generosity in offering to share the questions. Got quite a lot of people asking for them, so we'll figure out a way to make those available via the CIPD website, if that's okay. I'm going to go into Q&A. We've had some really great questions. Can I ask Peter and Sharron to unmute themselves, please, so I can put questions to you? So we've had a couple about creating water cooler environments while being remote, or any advice on team cohesiveness when we're not in the same place. Sharron, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've been particularly mindful of as an organisation, and probably like many, we've done alternative things as best as we can. So examples would include things like Zoom coffees. We've had WOS sessions, wine over Zoom in the evening, clearly not in work time, just to help people to try and build the relationships more informally as best as they can. We've also inducted quite a big student population over this period of time, and so what we've done for them is run separate webinars that are large gatherings and then small gatherings, so that they can start to build their own local communities, because certainly that sense of trying to establish your own network is very, very important at this point. So trying various different things, I think, at the moment.
And Tim, have there been any tools that you found particularly useful?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think, I mean, some of Sharon's we use. So we've encouraged people to have quiz times. That you heard about the connecting colleagues. I mean, that for me has been the most powerful. I'm meeting with colleagues that I would not normally connect with, like a social exchange. It's 15 minutes a week, but my word, I've got more insights from them. And that's not just something I'm doing. It's, you know, I think at its peak, we had over 1,000 colleagues doing it in 1 week. So that's been very, very powerful. I think, I say this respectfully about social distancing. If you can also meet with people in large open spaces in small numbers, I would also consider that wherever that's possible, because I found the concept of trying to induct colleagues when they're new to the organization and they've not met their colleagues is difficult. So I'm not in any way suggesting that we should breach social guidelines in any country, but I think where you can meet people socially distanced and safely, you should also try to consider that as well, because we miss that human contact wherever that's possible in certain cities or locations.
Thank you. Peter, can I ask you a question that was submitted in advance around what are the key hooks that HR professionals can use to influence senior directors about the need for change, rather than simply flipping back, as I think you put it? So how do you positively challenge?
It's a great question, and a question a lot of people are asking, because if we're honest, I mean, whilst we've got two great exemplar organizations talking about the positive change, not every business leader thinks about it in these sorts of terms. So I would say, I mean, sort of building on what we've heard from Sharon and Tim, is first of all to call out and really recognize the positive things. I mean, Tim in particular, a lot of good data about what the organization, what the stock exchange has learned from these forms of remote working. And there's nothing more powerful that influences the skeptical business leaders on, you know, good data, good evidence, and good support and analysis is to take forward. So I suppose it's always been true, hasn't it, about challenging HR is to influence sometimes skeptical leaders on need for change, particularly when it comes to things like culture, which are not always easy things to understand. But I would say there's no substitute for good analysis, good understanding and insight of the kind we've heard today. Use that to help to influence the wider discussion. And
Tim, have you found the use of data useful there?
Yeah, I mean, not just useful. I mean, we had some debates as a management. I don't mind sharing them with you. We do quite a lot around 360-degree feedback. So in our organisation, working for the executive committee or MDs, and then the next level is directors, we had a big debate. Do we go ahead with a 360-degree feedback exercise remotely? And we said yes, and then we've actually rolled it out for our directors. So MDs is about 100, our directors is close to 500, and that's live at the moment. Many people are saying, well, why are you doing it when we're working remotely? But the reality is we all need to be learning how we're doing in this situation. So I'd guide people to continue to be bold in these areas. We were a little regretful we couldn't implement a leadership program. We've just turned it on its head and we've put a webinar-based program that we're developing. So try to think creatively to still try to give people that intervention, because one thing I am finding is that people are craving development because they're not getting quite as much as they would perhaps in a work office environment.
Yeah, and actually building on that, we've had a question about how do you believe leadership development and training needs to change to support ongoing cultural change. Sharon, any thoughts on that, building on perhaps what Tim's just said?
Yeah, I think very similarly to Tim. So we've done a lot of work over the last few months, probably accelerated, like many organisations, the way that we deliver learning. So a lot more virtual, a lot more digital learning. Something that we wanted to do anyway, so that's very good news. But one of the things we particularly concentrated on is about helping leaders to lead virtually and remotely, and to some extent people do anyway, but I think that this has actually just given us the opportunity to focus on it more.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about obviously we're all at home right now. Peter's not, Peter's in the office, but the rest of us are at home. And you talked, I think, Tim, I love that phrase about, are we working from home or sleeping at work? So how do we avoid this always on culture when that kind of delineation is quite hard? Peter, can I put that to you first?
Yeah, no, it's such an important question. I mean, I think first of all is to reflect it for ourselves individually. I mean, there are things we've got to be conscious of, and we're all guilty of it, me included, that when you're working from home, those boundaries become less clear. So I'd say first and foremost is to recognize that for yourselves in terms of saying, okay, so let's make that discipline and routine that I will start work at 6, or I will take that lunch break. But at the same time, I think, of course, what we can do culturally within organizations, sending those signals from the top, because if we're honest, a lot of stuff about presenteeism and ways of working is because of what they see people above them doing, all the way through to the tops of organizations. So we got to set examples as leaders. And then I think what we're also seeing is organizations starting to think creatively about, so how do I have working practices, if you will, that put more structure into people's days? So I was talking to one of the big banks recently, saying that they are making sure that between 12 and 2, there are no meetings, because I mean, there's the other factor of our modern working world now, is you can bounce endlessly from the structure of that nature into people's work routines. I think is also something that we've got to think about.
Yeah, and then to build on that, somebody's put in a great comment about seeing some research yesterday that indicated people miss one element of their previously required commute, and that was the time for themselves. So Tim and Sharon, what are your organizations doing to challenge this thinking that we don't need to have permission or an excuse to have time and space to think?
We had a debate. There came some suggestions from some colleague groups about needing my time or me time. And we did debate whether that should be on a Friday. And because we were trying to demystify the issue regarding Friday afternoons, we actually went with Wednesday afternoons from 3 to the end of the day is known as midweek my time. And everyone's diary is clear. Now, of course, there will be some leaders that will still work occasionally in that period, but literally it's up to you what you use that for. It might be your mid-year review. It might be your development. It might be a learning module. But it's basically, we do not put meetings in. And even in Sri Lanka, who are working UK hours, we've adapted it for them so they can, because they're supporting our businesses in Europe, we've adapted for them at the same time. That has gone down brilliantly. We did wrestle whether it was Wednesday or Friday, and I think picking Wednesday was the right time to do it. And the feedback has been absolutely fantastic from our colleagues.
I love that. It's a brilliant idea. What about within Deloitte, Sharon?
Yeah, so because we've worked flexibly for quite a long time, we didn't particularly establish any times or days or anything, because people tend to have a different pattern of work anyway. But one of the things in terms of helping to develop our leaders at the beginning is we provided a lot of guidance, FAQs, etc., that helped to encourage them to have an early dialogue with their people to talk about what would work for them. So actually what we've encouraged is individuals to say, I need to work at these particular times, I need to not work at these particular times. For example, I've got to do certain lessons for my children, homeschooling, etc. So what we did was we've just adapted or enabled people to adapt their day, so they're not working normal core hours, they're working about when it suits them. And I think that very much reflects our focus on the output rather than actually just doing a normal day job.
Thank you. And somebody has put in the chat that they've introduced a free from Friday, a day free from meetings to allow people to get on with work, projects, research, etc., which has worked really well. Great to see some creative ideas coming through. We had a question, or a couple of questions actually, about inclusion. Somebody said that through the work they do with senior execs, it appears that the organisations which had more inclusive cultures pre-COVID-19 have fared better. Would you agree? And do you think a continued focus on inclusive cultures is required? And Sharon, I think you mentioned inclusion as being very important to your organisation, so I'll put that to you first.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I was giving an example earlier about how it's enabled us to drive that agenda forward. Peter, I think you talked about really pushing the inclusion agenda, and this is something that perhaps we were surprised that it's enabled us to do. So one of the things is we were all recognising that, there's growing urbanisation, there's a need for everybody to live and work in cities. Actually, this has enabled us to rethink that and say, do we really need people to be in the cities? Actually, no, we probably don't. Certainly as an organisation, I think somebody had asked a question earlier, to what extent are we going to, and have we realised that we need to adapt our culture? Probably recognised how London-centric we are. And actually, we have some big regional offices, and there is no reason why we can't operate out of those offices or even operate more remotely. And I think that's been a really good learn for us.
Thank you. And Peter, I know you did type an answer to this, but have to say your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question. And I do actually genuinely believe that organizations which were more inclusive have fared better, because at the heart of the idea of inclusion is respect for individuals, care about people, and all of those sorts of ideas, and safe and open cultures. And those are absolutely critical attributes. You've heard a lot of very good examples through this webinar, critical attributes of what the good organizations are thinking about now. So if you already had that way of thinking a culture, I think it certainly enabled you through this time as well. Which doesn't mean to say if you didn't have those cultures that you're a bit, stuffed, as it were, because that is the opportunity, isn't it? It's the opportunity to recognize that that's what you now have learned through some of this, is more connection, more care for people, more respect for individuals, and understanding different circumstances and engaging with people. I think you heard it from both Sharon and Tim. Even the fact that we're dialing into people's homes has made us understand people as individuals more than we had perhaps in the past. And those are all essential attributes of inclusive cultures. But the final point I make, which is to echo what Sharon just said, is we have got to keep the focus on this. I genuinely worry that with all the economic anxiety and restructuring and everything else, as people have said, well, maybe that gets pushed slightly to the side, the inclusion agenda, and it cannot. It must be part of our central strategic agenda and our response in building responsible and effective organizations longer term, and we must keep that up.
Thank you. I'm sure everybody who watches these webinars is getting very sick of seeing my sofa and my poster of Danish chairs always in the same place. Tim, any advice on, so there's loads of great opportunities we've identified around improving culture, connection, inclusion. What about when things get difficult? How do you deal with conflict or dispute or grievances? And can you do that remotely and virtually well?
I mean, I think if you'd asked me this 3 or 4 months ago, I would have said probably no. But the reality is, organisations still need to continue. And I think whilst we all hope that globally we'll be able to deal with COVID quickly, I think this is with us. This way of working is with us for some time. So we have had to deal with all of those aspects in a virtual way. And in reality, for us, we've always tried to treat our colleagues really as adults. They're knowledge workers, they're well educated, they know exactly what really are the right things to do. So we haven't stopped doing things that you've just described there, Katie, because of COVID. We've just continued, but we've had to do it with more care, and we've had to do it with more support, because the support structures and the ability to read body language, as much as you can read it to a point in this format, it's much, much harder than a face-to-face meeting. So we've definitely taken time where we have had inevitable speak up aspects or grievances in those situations. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sharon, any thoughts on handling difficult situations?
I think very similarly to Tim, I think perhaps it's one of those things that almost HR professionals might dread, in the sense of having had so much history of people being fired by text and things like that. But actually what we've done is very much like Tim. It's enabled us perhaps to be more considered in how we do these things, and to think about helping the person to prepare, ensuring that they have somewhere that's quiet, that's appropriate to have a dialogue. So I think it's important that these things don't stop, but I think that it encourages us to think more comprehensively about what we need to do to do it well and to do it supportively.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one more very quick question to both of you, because you're in global organisations, and Peter as well, actually. How did you manage the cultural differences? Or were there any cultural differences or communication barriers, Tim?
Yes. I mean, I gave it a couple of the Sri Lankan examples, I think, earlier. We always seek to take a global approach, but occasionally apply local or country support. So when it came to the manager workshops, we did those locally, because we felt that there could be a more active response in those locations, whereas things like learning or webinars we did on a global scale. So I think it's really important that we all maintain that global outlook, that inquisitiveness that enables us to do things differently. And that's how we approach. But our first instance is take a global approach wherever we can.
And Sharon, have you noticed any differences?
I think very similarly, it's been things like well-being. Why wouldn't you take a global approach? And I think other things perhaps we've been more culturally aware of. So for example, some of our offices did open more quickly if people felt that it was more appropriate to return to work. But I think that, as I say, we've shared those best practices and insights so that we can form each other geography. And I think one of the things it has done is perhaps enabled us to connect better as a firm, and to talk more about how do you actually coordinate as you can and learn from each other in a situation that nobody had experienced before.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up there because I've gone 1 minute over, which is very, very naughty of me. So I'm afraid that is all we've got time for this afternoon. So thank you so much, Sharon and Peter and Tim. Really glad you got on there in the end.
Me too.
For sharing your stories and answering questions so well. This webinar and the slides will be available on demand from this afternoon, and we'll try and we'll talk to Tim about making the questions available as well. A reminder that you can sign up to our future webinars, which are going to be running next week via the CIPD website, and then we're going to take a little bit of a break over the summer. And a final reminder about our new wellbeing support for members in the UK and Ireland, with a free 24/7 telephone helpline staffed by qualified therapists and provided by Health Assured. Thanks very much everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your incredibly thoughtful, interesting questions, and we shall see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. I'm going to end the webinar.